Hello, everyone. This is Mark Radulich of the Radulich and Broadcasting Network, and this is a TV Party Tonight Extra. Seems that whenever we do some of these TV Party Tonight Extras, it's because yet another person in the world of professional wrestling has passed away. Today, we lost one of the greats, the voice of wrestling of my childhood, Mean Gene Okerlund, who passed away at the ripe old age of 76. Here to talk a little bit about what he meant to us and share some memories and some of the great moments of his career that we're aware of in wrestling is Mr. Toxic Masculinity, the punchy pugilist, Pat Mullen. How you doing tonight, Pat?
It is what it is. Today will be forever known as the day the 76 died.
Yeah, this is we lost like three in rapid succession. There was him, there was the captain of the Captain Antonio, and then what was the third one? Oh, the third one was
Super Dave Osborne.
Yeah, Super Dave. Yeah, that was a rough day, man.
All of whom at 76 years old.
So, what's your earliest memories of Mean Gene Okerlund? Did you get to see him in the AWA, or were you like me? Mean Gene was as much a part of Hulkamania as Hulk Hogan was.
I saw him, years later after the fact in the AWA, but, the Mean Gene I grew up with and knew, it was, WWF Mean Gene. Let me tell you something, Mean Gene Okerlund.
Yeah, as anyone has heard these extras before, has heard me and Pat talk about wrestling, know that I grew up in Long Island, New York, and I grew up on the Superstars of Wrestling, which was noon on Channel 5, and, you had Vince McMahon and Bobby Heenan, or you had Gorilla and Jesse Ventura, but the man standing up with the stick, the man doing all the backstage interviews was, oh my goodness, Mr. Gene Okerlund. I even had his little rubber figure. He was one of the ones that I got. I always thought he was such a great straight man to all these nutty characters. I mean, here's a guy who could stand next to the intensity of Hulk Hogan, or the insanity of the Ultimate Warrior, or the intimidating villain Andre the Giant, or somebody who was as abusive as the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. And he never felt out of place. He always felt like, even though he's a fairly, by comparison, he's 5'9", at least that's his build height. But he was such short stature to all of these giants around him, and yet he stood straight up with them, chin to chin. And I always enjoyed, probably of any non-wrestler entity, I always enjoyed his stuff with them. His reactions were some of the best.
Even on the stuff where it very clearly was supposed to go one way and didn't, on pre-tapes or interviews, even Gene just doing whatever he was going to do with it made it fun to watch. Whether no matter how off the rails it got, and there's some ones out there that you can very easily look up on YouTube or Dailymotion where this interview is not supposed to be like this.
There was, do you remember one in particular where, it absolutely looked like he was reacting to some sort of nuttiness happening around him that he was not aware was going to happen?
Okay, so there's a great video out there called Ken Patera Murders a Promo. And now we just talked about what a great straight man Gene was, and he was, 100%. However, even Gene could not keep it together during this awful, all over the place, whatever the hell Patera was trying to do promo. And Gene, at a certain point, just covers his face, turns visibly red, and is hysterically laughing. And it's bad when the best straight man of all time can't even keep it together for this, monstrosity that he's got in front of him.
My favorite memory of Gene Okerlund, my favorite early memory of Gene Okerlund, as a kid, I got one of those Coliseum videotapes, and it's the one where he and Hulk Hogan were training for a match against Mr. Fuji and George Steele in Minneapolis. And, truth be told, I don't even remember the match. I didn't even remember who they were wrestling. But the training sequences were so funny. Like, I remember as a little kid, and I didn't know much about Gene Okerlund. I just knew that he was an interviewer, so I didn't understand why he was wrestling with Hulk Hogan in the first place. But it's wrestling, and crazy things happened. Years later, Jim Cornette would be wearing this entire Lycra outfit to wrestle in, and Jim Ross would say, that's a walking ball of cholesterol! So it's wrestling. But I remember watching this video cassette, and like half of it was just Hogan doing these training skits with Mean Gene, and it opens with him saying, Gene, it's 5:00 in the morning, and Gene's at his breakfast table, and he's smoking a cigar, and he's eating pancakes, and Hogan's like, "What are you doing?" And then they do the bit with the eggs. I remember as a kid the few times that that I was lifting weights or working out or whatever. I attempted to do the bit with the eggs. Those raw eggs are rough to get down, man.
Yeah, they also don't have the same effect that they want you to think they have.
I'm sure.
Or like that.
But I remember watching, just the best part about that was because Hogan's Hogan. Hogan is Mr. Intensity. He's always going to be the biggest thing in a room. But he doesn't work nearly as well if he doesn't have someone funny to play off of. And there's Gene, who's like practically grabbing his pearls. Oh my! He's taking away his cigar, and he was like, you're getting ready for the whole concept of them getting ready for a match. And Gene's like, but why can't I have my pancakes? And why can't I have my cigar? And then they would show them running.
He wants to stop during the middle of their workout for a beer and a brat at the cart.
Right. And him taking umbrage with Hogan, like, how dare you, sir? How dare you stop me from getting my beer and my brat? Oh, that's good stuff. There are some highlights. I'm just looking at the Wikipedia page. There's a bit where Okerlund turned and said fuck it with some other words.
Oh, with Rick Rude and Bobby Heenan.
Yeah.
That's a legendary one right there.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember any other of the bloopers that he was involved with?
This one's not so much a blooper, but just, we've talked at times about how when WCW went downhill, it was just nobody gave a damn. It was terrible to watch. And it was pretty clear at certain points that, like, the people involved didn't give a shit either. And there's one promo that they're doing with a couple of guys called the Natural Born Thrillers, who are going to be like WCW's young heel stable. And there was one guy named Mike Sanders who never really made it, and Gene just turns to him at one point and just calls him a little prick, which is fantastic. And there's, like, you talked about the Coliseum videos. So one of the best ones is one they did about the Hart Foundation. Jim Neidhart, Bret Hart, Jimmy Hart. And part of what they did is, this is one of the things Gene was so great about on these videos, is doing like a man on the street routine.
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes to the offices of the Hart Foundation, and he's trying to show his press credentials. And at one point he shows his business card, and in true like cheapskate fashion goes, "Yeah, I'm going to need that back. I have a couple of phone numbers on there, area code 212 I'd like to keep."
What was great about Gene in the early WWF years was, he would be doing the stand-up routine with some of these really just over-the-top individuals, and he always had like this he always had this reaction where it was like, all right, like nobody ever really flustered him. You know what I mean? Like, he always like, okay, that's George the Animal Steel, and he'd kind of roll his eyes and like, back to you, Vince. He was just so funny to watch. But I think one of my other favorite memories was when he came back to the WWE after for WrestleMania 17. After WCW had shut down, and him and Bobby the Brain Heenan called the Gimmick Battle Royal.
Oh, that was fun.
That is like 20 minutes of pure comedy gold. between him and Bobby. I mean, and that was so good.
And that's another thing where there were certain people Gene had a chemistry with that made for special TV, where he could be great even just on his own. You give him whatever scenario and he would make it work. But when you pair him with somebody like Bobby Heenan, he's just allowed all kinds of leeway and room to do pretty much anything, because Bobby is such a good ad-libber. He'll play right off of him, and it would just make magic every time.
Has anyone been as good as he was? Whether you've got you've got Tony Schiavone in WCW, or you've had. Jim Ross never really held the stick backstage. That was Michael Cole who started that way. Can you think of anybody who can even approach Gene Okerlund, since the heyday of the Hulkamania?
Oh, absolutely not. And it speaks to Gene's talent level, because there's been some good ones.
Mm.
There's, I didn't think Sean Mooney was bad at all when he was with the WWF, though it was abbreviated, and he was working as a contemporary of Gene's. It's just he had Gene there with him, so he was always going to be overshadowed by that. WCW never really had a great presence like that to me until they got Gene. And really, he was really the first of his kind, which is, I think, why he was so endearing for so long and so good at what he did. Gene was the guy who set that format and that stage where no matter how out of the box or absurd this character was, Gene's goal was he was going to play the straight man, sell this as seriously as he could, and get in one every now and then when he could, just to kind of surmise that he was aware of the situation he was in, and get a laugh from the person at home that wasn't intended with their initial viewing.
One of my favorite WCW memories of his, and there aren't too many, but once again featured Hulk Hogan. It was the night Hogan joined the NWO. But what people remember about that as far as commentators is Bobby Heenan going, but what side is he on? But I don't think enough credit is paid to Gene Okerlund and how he handled that, because he really sold it like Hogan had betrayed his fans, he had betrayed the company, and Gene conducted that interview like he was disappointed in Hogan. And it came across so personal. And it just, people were throwing garbage and everything in the ring, and for whatever their reasons were that they threw the garbage in there, I think the way that he did that interview with Hogan just made it worse. We joke about, it's still real to me and that sort of thing, but, people had a natural reaction to Hogan turning turning heel and joining the NWO. And then you had Gene, who acted like any number of those fans in the audience. But he had the microphone, and he was, and I remember him saying, he was like, if you follow through with this, and if you join these two men, Hall and Nash, you'll be no better than the garbage being thrown into this ring. And that's pretty strong stuff, because they could have handled that any number of ways, and being WCW, they could have handled it badly, but no, they let him go in there like, here, act like this is real, give this that extra gravitas that it needs to put it over the top, and he did, and it's probably one of my most vivid memories of him in WCW.
If anybody besides Gene does that interview, it doesn't work. Because, firstly, not even just the long-time association with Hulk from the AWA and the WWE, but the fact that Gene knew how to play that. Gene is your A interview. Gene is in a suit. Gene has that reaction. If somebody like Mike Tenay would have been in there, it wouldn't have mattered.
Right. So you said that you're aware of his AWA run. Any marked difference between the way that he did his thing in the AWA versus how he would do things in the WWF?
So Gene was the goal with Gene was always later on to have him be just a neutral interview party and only really get outraged at like really devastating heel stuff that went on. In the AWA, it was a much more professionally editorial kind of Gene, which is a weird way to say it. But Gene, more than kind of doing the interviews, would editorialize the situation first because Gene came from a newscaster background in Minneapolis, and so he kind of added that, and the presentation then too, it fit because it was more sport presentation than what we've come to know as sports entertainment. So it was a right fit for that. When he got to the WWF and the entertainment level clicked, and you got to see more of Gene's kind of sharp wit and real quick mind on that, he became more fun while still keeping that professional detail about himself.
One of the more recent memories I have of Gene Okerlund was Legends House. What'd you think of him on Legends House? Now, for those of you who are listening to this who didn't know what that was, it was the WWE's attempt at a reality TV show where they took old-time WWF legends, managers, Howard Finkel, some wrestlers, Roddy Piper, for example. Who else was in there? It was Roddy Piper,
Hillbilly Jim, Hacksaw Duggan,
right? Jimmy Hart, Gene Okerlund,
Tony Atlas, Pat Patterson.
Mm-hmm. So they all put him in the house together, and they lived there for like 6 weeks or whatever it was, and they had a producer there, pushing them to go out on these different adventures and whatnot, and tried to create comedy out of some of these interactions. I personally thought Gene Okerlund was hilarious on the show. It was one of the high points, as opposed to a very sullen and somewhat crazy at times Roddy Piper. But what did you think of Gene Okerlund on Legends House?
Oh, loved him, because that was like an unrestrained version of Gene Okerlund, where that sarcastic wit that we got to see displayed sometimes, in the interviews that would kind of be wink and nudge type stuff to us, he got to do full blast on his contemporaries when they annoyed him. And that was fantastic.
I don't have a whole lot else here. I mean, he, whenever I think of Hulkamania, I think of Gene Okerlund. When I think of the Monday Night Wars in WCW, I think of Gene Okerlund. And, he's been out of the public eye for, years now. He's been retired, outside of some appearances and stuff like that here and there on Raw. But I'm going to pitch it over to you. Any memories, anything else you want to talk about, anything that I didn't bring up that needs to be talked about?
I think, again, the most important part of Mean Gene and his legacy is that he really was the first of his kind. This really professional interviewer who gave this gravitas to the interviews he was conducting, and he was quickly the first guy who they really made him the A version of that particular role, where on a given night, if Gene was doing the interview, it was seen as the A interview, and maybe somebody else, Craig DeGeorge, Sean Mooney, etc., they were doing the B interviews. Gene was versatile enough that not only did they have him do that, but they would put him in on play-by-play. Even though that's not what he was really ever there for, he could still do it. Gene got involved later on in the production aspect of a lot of these things, and so what you see produced, a lot of that was done by Gene Okerlund and Bobby Heenan, who were eventually given roles in that because they felt everything those guys did was so good that they could help other people do it, and they weren't wrong. Gene's classic outrage to anything heelish is always a pleasure to watch. Him letting that, wit go and just really crack you up is always something to see, where he sometimes will just let a certain line go or the way he'll sell something. like him and Jake Roberts on Saturday Night's Main Event, where his hand is constantly shaking because Jake has Damian draped around him, and Gene is terrified, but still conducts the interview. Or when he outright he lambastes somebody for something they did that was terrible, and they just immediately knock him. Like Jake comes back and says to him, well, if you believe Ricky Steamboat has a chance of beating me, you ought to go back to selling dictionaries. And he responds, I never sold dictionaries. And Jake just goes, you couldn't even sell one of those, huh? And Gene was never trying to get the last word in and upstage, the talent. He knew the talent had to be showcased in such a way, and he was so good at it.
I think that's what's missing today in wrestling. Just general, authentic reactions. Everything is so planned out now and so sanitized. You don't. This is a Jim Ross moment, not a Gene Okerlund moment. But you don't get the as God is my witness, he's broken in half.
No, Gene wasn't playing a character. Gene was being Gene.
But that was the thing. He reacted. He reacted realistically to what was being presented in front of him. If you're going to have a guy, screaming about one thing or the other in front of him, he reacted to that. If you're going to have a guy, who would act like the $1 Million Man and talk, and knock basketballs out of a black kid's hand and whatnot, he reacted to that, and he reacted honestly, like the way any normal human would react. And I feel like on the one hand, the ability of some of these wrestlers, or the freedom of some of these wrestlers and personalities to be able to do that, is gone. And just the style that allows that sort of thing to exist is also gone now. It's just a much different product. And when we do these shows and we think about these wrestlers and personalities that are no longer with us, it makes me long for those days. I mean, everyone says, "Oh, I wish we could go back to the Attitude Era." There are times I wish we could go back to Hulkamania, where where things seemed, not because I was a particular fan of Hulk Hogan, but more of the genuine excitement in the air, and not so much of a sanitized, homogenized product for as many demographics as possible. There's just something about Gene and his counterparts in their time that gave it a feel that it doesn't have today. And
here's the funny part, I know a fair amount about wrestling and people and personalities. Something I never knew before today is that me and Gene Okerlund is in the South Dakota Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Really?
So before he was ever Mean Gene Okerlund, Gene was part of a rockabilly type band, and his name was Gene Carroll. It was his stage name. He had a band called Gene Carroll and the Shades, and they had a minor local hit record, and they played through the 50s into the 60s, and he's actually credited as the songwriter on the 45 with his real name, Gene Okerlund. And it's just so weird to see that side of him, because if you remember growing up in the era we did, he sang on Pile Driver, the wrestling album. He sang a version of Tutti Frutti, and then it's all in good fun and whatever, and Gene's a showman. And then you find out that, oh wait, he actually really did do stuff like this, and he was somewhat successful at it. Because they released an album and it sold well in that, like I said, that Midwest area. They sound a lot like, bands of the era, and Gene is the lead singer. And you can look it up, and there's pictures of a young head full of hair, which is the scary part of seeing this, because that's one thing you never expect to see with Gene Okerlund when you think of him. It's a full head of hair and no mustache. But it just shows this talent level of what he can do. And after the band broke up, he got some advertising work in. He was a local anchorman and weatherman in Minnesota, and then that led to his association with the AWA, and that led to this legacy and creation of, the best interviewer, I should say, in, the history of professional wrestling, not just WWE, not just AWA, but ever. And with the way the product is produced today, I don't think we're ever going to see something like that, or like him, I should say, someone like him again. And it's a shame on the one hand, but I think it's also kind of a fitting tribute and shows just how talented and how great Gene was at what he did, and how important he was to what he did.
I don't think I could have said it better myself. I think it's a great place to end this. We just wanted to do a short remembrance of a man that we loved in professional wrestling, Mean Gene Okerlund. So with that, Pat, any quick plugs you want to give us?
Unfortunately, I'll share this one kind of sad moment about this whole thing. So in the end of April, they're doing a convention near me called 80s Wrestling Con. And one of the guests was going to be Gene Okerlund, whom I had never had the pleasure of meeting, and was really right at the top of my list of people I really wanted to meet at that. And unfortunately, that's not going to happen now. So on a personal note, that's pretty depressing. However, there's some good stuff going on too. Shortly, you will hear myself and Mark again on a TV party. We will be discussing Season 4 of the Netflix original continuation series, Fuller House. Hijinks ensue. There's laughter. There's family time. You'll enjoy it. We always do.
You can also check out Pat and I review Into the Spider-Verse, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. That's in the archives. So you want to hear what Pat's thoughts were on what he considers to be one of the worst Spider-Man movies he's ever seen.
Yes, can't wait for your death threats and flaming bags.
Go ahead into the archives and check out our review of Into the Spider-Verse. As we're recording this, tonight is also the Metal Hammer of Doom, our year-end special. Robert Cooper is back. Jesse Starcher's got all the stats. We've got all the music. It's going to be a fun time, so we hope you'll tune in to hear that. All right, so for Mr. Pat Mullen, I am your mandated reporter, Mr. Mark Rattledge. For the late, great, Mean Gene Okerlund, be well, be safe, and behave.